So what we'll eventually do, this is as the announcement said. Now, I'll repeat a bit of this in, excuse me, in just a couple minutes. It's really student-centered. It's really to provide a forum for students to work through the richness and the complexity of literary text, Shakespeare text specifically. So I'll just kind of provide a bit of context, but it's really an opportunity for Kayla and Leah to kind of guide us through this reading. So in a more formal way, I'll say that again once we officially start, and then we'll get to Kayla and Leah as quickly as possible. And don't feel constrained by the text itself. This is really about us using the text to think about the issues, the problems that we confront in today's society. All right. So, and that's the spirit of what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to reorient people to literature in a way where they're using it for their interest, not worshiping the literary text, like kind of a quasi-religious celebration of great works of literature. So we're trying to move away from that kind of secular religious approach to literature to how does this help us understand who we are and work through the problems that we confront, you know? Okay, so we can start officially. I'm picking up some background noise. Okay, so thank you all for joining us. Welcome to this inaugural gathering of Shakespeare for Today. My name is Eric DeBarros, and I'm an assistant professor of English literature here at ODU, specializing in Shakespeare studies in early modern British literature. My co-facilitators for today's discussion of Romeo and Juliet and the injustice of economic inequality are Kayla Smith, who is a junior English major, and Leah Anasato, who is a sophomore English major. As our announcement describes, the goal of these gatherings is to bring people together to test the capacity of Shakespearean expression to help us understand and imagine solutions for the persistent problems of today. Well, I've been thinking about doing something like this for a long time. It was the wonderful discussions that developed out of the team presentations in last semester's Shakespeare class that inspired this final push. Of course, COVID has changed everything. But despite the current and hopefully temporary limitations, it is our hope that we will be able to preserve and perhaps disperse that spirit of collective problem solving generated in that class, okay? So finally, before I turn things over to Kayla and Leah, I just wanted to provide a little bit more context for those of you who didn't have a chance to read the attached description. The passage that Kayla and Leah will be reading comes at the end of the play, when Romeo uncharacteristically notices and reflects profoundly on the poverty as represented by the apothecary, otherwise ignored or marginalized in the play. So with that, I'll turn things over to Kayla and Leah. And let me share the screen for you.
All right, then. First of all, thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to do this with everybody. And I just want to start off with saying that last semester when we had this class and we were able to do these discussions, it really opened up these passages and these Shakespearean texts for me in a new way that made me realize that I was reading these wrong. Well, there's no wrong way to read a text, but I wasn't reading as deep as I could, and it became more fascinating when I was able to read these passages in this close way that highlighted how it's applicable to today's world. So I just want you to have like an open mind as you listen to this, and that understand that all of your connections and everything you see in it is valid and is worth exploring, and I hope you enjoy it. So I'm going to start off with reading the text and reflecting on it as I do so. Thank you for being here. All right. Romeo. I do remember an apothecary, and hereabouts a dwells, which late I noted. And I want to make notice of this part, which late I noted. What's changed the most for him in this point since when he's in this, which late I noted section, is that he's been banished from his former home, and now he's living in Mantua, in a new city, without his family, without his relations, without his ties, with the strings that he actually had back in his old city. So now he's in Verona, and so now he's starting over, basically. Yes, in tattered weeds, with overwhelming brows, culling of simples, meager were his looks, sharp misery had worn him to the bones, and in his needy shop a tortoise hung, an alligator stuffed, and other skins of ill-shaped fishes, and about his shelves a beggarly account of empty boxes, green earthen pots, bladders, and musty seeds, remnants of packthread, and old cakes of roses. So I want to draw our attention to this part where he's really cataloging, and we see all the things that he's seeing. And he's seeing all these little parts that make up this apothecary. And he's seeing him as this miserable, lacking wretch. And we just see how he's cataloging him into this object, and he's noticing every little thing about him, and he kind of, from like an outsider's point of view, he's looking down on him a bit. And I just want that to be a point that we notice. We're thinly scattered to make up a show. Now this line really stood out to me. To make up a show, that's very outsider point of view. He's the audience. And it implies this like sort of romanticization almost of poverty, of his poverty. He's like seeing this apothecary who's obviously miserable and poor and starving, and he sees it as a show, as if the apothecary is putting on a show, or as if the apothecary is dressing things up or exaggerating. And this just shows how distanced our Romeo is from the poverty he sees. And he's looking down on it and looking from a higher point of view. And, okay. Noting this penury, to myself I said, and if a man did need poison now, whose sale is in present death in Mantua, here lives a caitiff wretch, would sell it to him. It's just more, we're starting to see how he plans to use what he sees in the apothecary, the poverty. He's going to use that. What ho, apothecary?
Who calls so loud?
Come hither, man. I see that thou art poor. So right there, just right off the bat, we see that there's the language that Romeo uses is very demanding, and it definitely demonstrates the dominance and the power that he knows he holds over the apothecary. And so he goes on to say, hold, there's 40 ducats. Let me have a dram of poison, such soon speeding gear as will disperse itself through all the veins. And just right there, from him having observed the shop and looking at all the little miscellaneous items that the apothecary had to offer, he assumed that the apothecary would even have poison in his possession, or that that's something that he would sell. And it kind of made me question what gave him that impression that the apothecary would have such an item. And it comes from that list that made me question that. Is it because he saw that he had like an alligator stuffed and other skins and tortoise hung and all these little extra nickets and knacks? So, yes.
Such mortal drugs I have, but Mantua's law is death to any he that utters them.
Art thou so bare and full of wretchedness and fearest to die? So in this line, we see Romeo actually using a lot of tactics and like this rhetoric to like convince the apothecary. And I think that's that's a reflection on the fact that Romeo has an education. He has been privileged enough to have an education. He's come from a background where he had money and prestige and the privilege that he could learn to use his words to convince people. And also, when we were talking about this passage before, Kayla mentioned that this line really shows how he's like using this guilting and shaming effect to, art thou so bare and full of wretchedness, as if to like to say that, are you so poor and so starving that you have no sense of, and fears like that you're still clinging to some weird morality, this like this sense of wrong, when he's like trying to guilt and shame his poverty, which just like kind of like lends to this thing that Romeo kind of sees the poverty as a choice, like as a show, something that's put on. Famine is in thy cheeks, need and oppression starveth in thy eyes, contempt and beggary hangs upon thy back. I think this is more of his cataloging and itemizing. This is more evidence of him just looking down on this apothecary and saying, look at you, this is what you look like, this is what you are. He's like applying these things to the apothecary and trying to get the apothecary to see him in the same way. And I think that's a very important point. And he goes on, the world is not thy friend, nor the world's law. The world affords no law to make thee rich. Then be not poor, but break it and take this. And now we suddenly see Romeo kind of trying to align them together. So far he's been like putting the apothecary lower and cataloging him as this poor and miserable person, and now he's suddenly saying that the world is not thy friend nor the world's law. He's suddenly grouping them together and trying to like empathize with the apothecary to say that they in breaking the law and selling him drugs, they're like actually working against the world and this world that's put him down in poverty, when in fact it's actually Romeo who is still using the apothecary. He's the one who's using the law and like these fear tactics. It's not the world so much as Romeo from his position of prestige and privilege that is using the apothecary.
My poverty, but not my will, consents. And so before Leah continues, I think that just in terms of what you've both been saying about linking, I think seeing with power, there's nothing matter of fact or innocent about Romeo seeing the apothecary. He is seeing the apothecary in a way that in some ways exercises or attempts to exercise his power over the apothecary. So I think that brings it brings the comments or the identifications, the analysis that you've been engaged in, it brings it together in that one line. So again, my poverty, but not my will, consents.
And before I continue, just go based off of what Professor was just talking about, that kind of raised a question to me to what extent is there a difference between seeing and verbalizing and acting upon that power that you hold over someone or that another person holds over a person who they deem as a lesser individual? And so Romeo goes on to say, there is thy gold, worse poison to men's souls, doing more murder in this loathsome world. And just right there, something that we discussed about that was kind of hilarious, and I had never thought about it, was why is it that elite individuals always portray money as something that's bad to the lesser? And that's a question I really want you guys to sit on and just think about, in your opinion, why you believe that is. And so he goes on to say, then these poor compounds that thou mayest not sell, I sell thee poison, thou hast sold me none. Farewell, buy food and get in thy flesh. And to me, this was kind of Romeo saying that this is your opportunity to do a little bit better, and kind of in relation to Leah's last passage of that the world affords no law to make thee rich, that he's kind of demonstrating that, you know, this is as good as it's going to get for you. It's not going to get any better than this, someone just coming in and basically throwing money at your face. So you should be grateful that I'm doing it in the first place and take it. I'm doing you a favor. And that's kind of what I got out of the language he was using, that demanding, that power hungry language.
Right. So here's the tentative thesis, the working thesis that we came up with. And I think central to that is the question, as we've been identifying, is the question of seeing and power. And what does it mean that when we take the effort to catalog or to, and I'm trying to remember the terms that Leah used, to catalog or to itemize, right? To catalog and itemize. What does that say? Even if you're doing it with at least consciously, the best of intentions, is power and your desire to maintain or establish power implicit in how you see someone, right? So that's something that developed after this working thesis, but I'll just read the working thesis for us. In a sense, the tragedy of the play is not the double suicide. It is the failure of the educated elite to see, understand, and work against this suffering. And specifically, it is that Romeo only addresses, we might say only sees that suffering when his own elite, self-absorbed life loses its value. So I think it's to say for us to be suspicious on how we look at others and how others look at us. This is, and I'm kind of compelled to share this with you because my 10-year-old daughter kind of illustrated this, or she shared this illustration, or she wanted to illustrate or be a part of this. This is, as you see in the middle, Romeo, and as a representative of the educated elite, we might understand that of those who have the skills to see, that is to represent the world and the people in it and even themselves. So if we have the Shakespearean world over here, everything is focused on tragic love and family conflict. And we wanted to engage in a cross-historical consideration of those elements within our society. Of course, we're in a political season. So those things that focus on conflict, political tribalism, racial division, social media, sports and entertainment, antagonists, they're all antagonistic, self-centered, pleasure-oriented. So think about the way right now we're in the midst of a political season. Think about how we're being in some ways asked or compelled to see each other and how power and the role of power in that seeing. So on the other side, the things that is marginalized or ignored until this specific scene, we have the apothecary. And there are other minor characters in the play that represent in a very kind of subtle and passing way these problems that open up for us when Romeo finally looks at the apothecary. And then so I wanted to compare those, the representation of that poverty to the inequality in our society today. That is the homeless, the working poor, the unemployed, the uneducated, the undereducated, the food insecure, the drug addicted, the abuse, the invisible. so that we spend, or how are we being in some way socialized to spend most of our time not paying attention to that inequality? And what does it mean when we do pay attention to it? Is it implicated with some sort of power? So the question, the general question, or just from the thesis as the working thesis, what do you think about, is it that Romeo only addresses that suffering when his own elite self-absorbed life loses its value? And for us to consider, is it possible for us to do better? And so that's general what we came up with. And Leah and Kayla, you might have other specific questions to ask?
Mm-hmm. So, other specific questions that I had that kind of came about, like you said, Professor, after we finished reading, it was kind of easier to formulate, and it was some stuff that we had discussed, such as, if Verona was so profitable, why do they not provide proper health care for their poor? Or in our society, why is healthcare difficult to obtain for those who are not as financially stable as the elite? And how would there be a difference if the apothecary was well funded compared to how he is in the position he is now? And then my last question was, what does it mean when someone construes you as less than who you are based off of your appearance alone?
I have a couple questions too, but I also want to talk about Kayla's last one. So, like, what does it mean when people see you as something based on how you look? Just kind of going off something a little bit personal. I grew up in Japan, and from when I'm here, people see me as completely Asian. There's no question about it. But when I'm back in Japan, they can tell that my mom's actually American. They can tell from looking at me that I'm half American and half Japanese. And I kind of get treated as a spectacle because of that.
Wow.
It's kind of weird. Like, it's not exactly like mistreatment or bad treatment even, but that I'm just kind of a bit of a show. Like, they'll ask me to speak in English because that's so cool to them. Or just to, like, translate something or to read something in English. And it's almost harmless, but in a way it just kind of makes you feel a little bit like an object or a show. And I just want, continuing off what Kayla said, like, what ways do we see this today? Like, what ways do we see, like, how people see you, like the gaze that they have on you, and how it can, because it can be race, it can be gender, it can be class, like in Romeo and Apothecary's situation. So I just want us to, like, think about how we experience that today. Other things I wanted to consider was, like, in what way do we, like, kind of romanticize poverty? What ways do we kind of, like, promote it almost? And one thing Kayla mentioned that I actually thought was really interesting while we were talking before was ripped jeans. Like, just, and I like ripped jeans, to be honest. I think they're fashionable, cool, but it's kind of like this glorification of poverty almost. And other things I just kind of think was, like, even like the rags to riches story, like, that's popular in a lot of places, and in a way it almost seems like it's not romanticizing poverty, but in, like, in what ways do we see films, like stories, like books, like just showing rags to riches, like this kind of cool thing that you can use. Yeah, so those are I have other things, but those are my current main thoughts. So does anybody have anything they would like to add?
Let's go back to this. So what do we think?
I would like to add, like, way at the beginning when we were talking about when you said the wealthy don't, we were talking about, I don't know, I just kind of put, like, the wealth, it almost seemed like the wealthy don't want the poor to feel any kind of power because they're scared of losing their own power, you know? Like, we talked about this in our class professor, like on one of the first classes was how writing in English was just so powerful that what could it be used for, that it wasn't looked in that perspective of what we're doing right now, you know, like picking it apart, and that you can use it in a different way instead of just almost like romanticizing and gushing over it. Like, actually, you know, like it's a useful tool, not to just look at it as like, you know, a beautiful art form, but like it is like an intelligent thing that you can use, you know? Yeah, so the wealth just don't want to give the poor the power.
Right.
And that, and then going back to how people see you and how people experience it today, I just thought that was really interesting what you said about your culture, Leah, in Japan, and coming back. It almost feels like you live like very different lives, and you have lots of different identities, and I think that's not always a bad thing, like you said. Why should we have one identity? What is identity, you know? And maybe the wealthy who don't want the poor to be powerful, they wouldn't know their identity without their wealth, and they never want to lose that. So I liked all those questions, and I wrote them down because I think, you know, you need to have those questions for the rest of your life, because it's just an ongoing thing of life.
Kind of going off of that, also, like, the wealthy derive their power from the poor. Their power as in being wealthy is from there being poor people.
Right.
That's how it works. Right. So, like, I mean, there are other things like that work that way too, you know, like you have your power, but when you have power, you have to have power over somebody, so somebody doesn't have the power.
Right.
And then also going off Gabriella, I totally agree, like that gaze and that lens isn't always negative. And I'm not going to get specifically into the certain scenario, but, you know, from what I have experienced personally and what we were discussing last time, Leah and Professor, was I have been tokened before in a different complete setting of people who look different than me as the angry Black woman because of how I am, even though, like, you can hear how I talk. I'm not an angry person at all. Like, I am the calmest person I know. Like, I am very rational. I think things through, and I talk to people with the same respect that they give me. But for them to, there we go. Yeah, because it was so easy for them. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, for them to look at me and pin that on me, they use that as an excuse for why they didn't want to approach me if there was ever any issues they had with me, because they were like, oh, well, we feel like she's just going to get upset, start an argument with me, and try to fight me. And I was like, whoa, I'm not even a fighter like that. Like, I'm a lover, like, first and foremost. And so, yeah, and then what you were going based off of with the pencil being a very powerful instrument, you are absolutely right. I think it's even more powerful than a sword in most cases, because there's a reason, at least in my opinion, that impoverished communities have such underfunded schools, because you give these children the opportunity to learn efficiently and with so much quality that they grow up to make those changes in the system. But like we mentioned, the power hungry and elite don't want that change in the system. They want to be able to keep those people kind of like where Romeo has the apothecary, where they need them, where they rely on them. And so, yeah, I just thought that was really interesting, and I just wanted to go off that. Yes, Miss Daniela?
Forgive me, Kayla, for jumping in. I was just reminded yesterday when I was reading Professor DeBarro's notice of what this was going to be today. Immediately to mind came Blake's poem, "Pity would be no more if we didn't make somebody poor, and mercy no more could be if all were as happy as we."
Right.
You know, so that you're all totally, Leah and Kayla, completely on target with the understanding that it is precisely that maintaining people at a certain level of disempowerment and poverty, etc., allows, you know, the powerful class access to their power, and then their own sense that they can be benevolent on top of that, you know, that it whitewashes their sins, because then they can, you know, they can do something for them. So anyway, I'll go back to you.
Could I add that, you know, I from the discussion, my attention was drawn probably for the first time to the way in which when Romeo says, "Here's your gold, worst poison that I can give, you know, go and put some flesh on you." I mean, that's just like, you know, the contemporary idea that, okay, I'm not going to give a beggar money because they'll just go buy drugs, right? You know, I'm going to give them my, you know, leftover food or whatever, but also that sort of elite sense that, oh, you know, money is a poison to the soul, unless you don't have any.
Right.
But it's, you know, there was that contemporary resonance with the sort of scorn for the ability of the poor and the marginalized to actually use money wisely, that I thought, you know, in our time, as in the play, sort of justifies keeping them marginalized, right? Because if you give them money, what are they going to do with it? You know, not the right thing, unless you give them specific instructions. Go buy some food, get some flesh on yourself, right? Right. And thank you for you know, drawing that to my attention.
Oh yeah, and like I think we see here more of like Romeo's, his sense of being better, because he's saying, I know what's best for you, basically. I know what you need. And so I'm going to give it to you, but I know what's best. Like, he's kind of putting himself in the position. He's putting himself in the position of power to maintain that sense of power. And it's kind of like something Kayla mentioned before when we were talking. Was like, it's like parents telling you, you won't like the certain food that they're eating because it's an adult thing. They don't know. You don't know what this is. It's like when your parents tell you, you won't enjoy this. I know you. I know what's best for you. And that was something Kayla said that really like stood out to me too about that last passage. Yeah.
Yeah, I was really struck by something Bella said about identifying the language and the power of language, and represented in education. And I think we've talked about how key to keeping let's say the poor and powerless is denying them a quality education. And so Bella, you're identifying a very subtly presented element in the play itself early on, the difference between those who are educated and those who are not. So the play opens with a messenger unable to read the addressees of his letters, and then I think he asked one of the characters, it might have been Romeo, I believe, to read the name so he knows where to deliver the letters. So the play almost immediately identifies that as a key distinguishing element in power, privilege, access. Now we could ask, the apothecary has to have some kind of education to be an apothecary, but that might just represent that there are different kinds or levels of education. And certainly in the poetic reflections that we get from the likes of Romeo, right? That is the elite education. And in some ways we're distracted from the power contained, let's say the social political power contained in it, because so much of it is spent just reflecting on romantic love. And so it's a way of romanticizing the language in a way that deflects our attention away from the political power contained within the language. And it's only in the end that we see that, you know, this ability to catalog, to itemize, to describe is filled with all kinds of power that the play otherwise really just doesn't focus on. So a question I'm thinking as an educator, as a teacher, you know, to what extent are we drawn into the kind of education that really, and I think this is what you were getting at Bella, that the kind of education that deflects our attention away from the power of language to oppress, or perhaps even to liberate. So I think that there's where, you know, there is a struggle in education, you know, throughout, you know, all the way up through to high school, and even in college, that there's a struggle to teach or to introduce an orientation to language into poetry that isn't in some ways falling into that or maintaining that romanticization.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Yeah, everything that, like, I read The Great Gatsby in, what was it, 11th grade, and then I just read it again for my critical theory class, and we looked at it in a completely different way, because when I read it in high school, it was about the American dream, like rags to riches, but then when I read it this time, it was about, you know, structuralism, and then it was about, is it really about the American dream? And then you really have to like pick it apart about, maybe it isn't even about the American dream at all. It's about how it was written and why it was written the way it was written. And, you know, you're not really like romanticizing this book, you're criticizing the book in a way, you know, you're like picking it apart. And I just never thought I would do that to The Great Gatsby, because, you know, you're taught in these grade schools that it's one of America's greatest books, you know what I mean? Which I still think it's like a great book, you know, but you're never taught to, I don't know, to really look at literature in this way, you know. And I was just talking about this with someone on the phone last night, that I was talking about the class that I'm taking with you in Shakespeare, and I was like, I have never looked at literature like this in my life. And it needs to be looked at more as I don't like picking it apart. Like, there's so many other things to Romeo and Juliet than the tragedy of it, you know what I mean? There's just so many things in high school when I read it that we didn't even talk about this, you know what I mean? Like, maybe there wasn't enough time in high school, I don't know, but you know, there's just so much more to it. And I think that it's really important to look at it like almost like you're taking apart like a computer, and there's like different little parts, and you have to put it all back together, because when you're like taking apart this story, and then it's like you read it all again, and it's like never the same again.
Right.
And yeah, I think it's really important to look at literature in a different way, and English as a whole in a different way. So yeah, end of that.
I can
Yeah.
I just wanted to say I'm in sociology and criminal justice, and I never get to do this. So what Bella was just saying, I mean, this is a real treat for me to listen and think about Shakespeare, and to think about it in the way that y'all are doing here. And I wanted to comment on something. There are some, I wanted to comment on something that Kayla, I think, said early on. She said something like that it almost sounded like Romeo almost was equating poverty with having a poison, which is a crime. And in my field, sociology and criminal justice, class is a central concept. That's always been something that we have thought about. And our discipline and our society, and I'm thinking England too, has long equated class with crime. And so, if that's not all throughout Shakespeare, it would be a surprise to me. I had never thought about it before, but when you see it there, that's exactly what our whole discipline has a tendency to do. And the same thing with, I think you said this too, Kayla, it's almost like Romeo was saying that, almost like Romeo was saying that the apothecary chose to be poor. And that, I think, is something that we still have in our culture, is the idea that if you just picked yourself up and worked a little bit harder, you wouldn't be poor. And that permeates a lot of our policies. And anyway, there's a lot going on in that text, and I'm really enjoying this. Thank you.
Thank you.
And so I guess going off of Professor Triplett, is that how you pronounce your last name? Okay, cool. I didn't want to mispronounce it. But going off of what Professor Triplett said, that we have this notion of if you just work a little bit harder, pick yourself up. I guess my question is, how do we kind of go against this oppressive perceptions then? How can we actively change this, or at least begin altering it in our lives? Because I know we have all probably had a moment in our lives where we kind of misjudged someone, not intentionally, but just because of how our society is structured and how that's just the normal. So yeah, feel free to chime in.
That's the big question, right?
That is the big question. I ask myself that, one time I was in Target, I was in the parking lot and I was driving away and I saw a homeless person with a sign that said, help or whatever. And right behind them, there is a McDonald's that said, help wanted. And what I wanted to do was, instead of give them money, I wanted to be like, hey, they're hiring over there. And if you go to your resources, you could go to a public restroom, clean yourself up, walk in there. I can help you. But, I was probably, this was years ago, high school. So I was probably a little bit afraid to go talk to them or do any of that, or even help this person or say that to them. But to me, in my head, I just thought that was so if they just turned around, there is a sign there for them. But that is the big question, because instead of saying pick yourself up, because I also think that's a very privileged thing to say, because for people like us, I guess, who have get to go to an education, are in college, get to have these jobs, have food on the table, all this stuff, when we're having really bad days or really bad times, we honestly have the luxury to literally say to ourselves, let me pick myself back up. And some people, this even goes deep into mental health, I feel where you cannot bring these people, these homeless people, if we really want to go into this, I think it stems down into mental health, and that they have no idea how to get out of it.
Right.
And they can't, they literally can't do it by themselves. They just can't.
Bella, what I'm interested in is all that goes into how you even see the homeless person.
Right.
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 In other words, we can't take for granted how we're seeing something. We have to be ever conscious of the way in which we've been conditioned to see people in a certain way. And I think that you identified in some ways the beginning of the answer is in some ways connected to or contained within education, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Right, and I'm not saying the education for the homeless person,
right.
I'm saying the education for everyone, but especially those in positions of power.
100%.
How are they educated to see suffering,
Yeah.
inequality, oppression
Right.
in a way that doesn't just, in some ways, reaffirm their superiority,
Right.
right?
Yeah, it's like, how do you show that to them? How do you get them to want to see that, you know? It's I'm trying, you guys, like, like with everything.
That's all we can do, right?
Yeah.
Well, I thought, Bella, that, I mean, your sort of, confession of this, this viewpoint is, really, really telling, because, I mean, it does show that now when you don't look at the Great Gatsby reverently, or you read Shakespeare critically, I mean, that's when we begin to understand, and I think, Eric is certainly, pointing this out, that's when we begin to recognize that we've got to question ourselves, because there are so many implicit biases, even among those of us who want to be and are, trying to be on the right side and do the right thing. But, we're just, I mean, we get caught.
And it's hard because it's like, what is the right thing? What is the right solution for this and for what person? And what this new way of literature that I am learning is hard. Like, it's hard.
Oh, yeah.
Because my whole life, all throughout high school, Professor Jacobs, probably your class was the first one I was like, what am I reading? Every single day I was in a study group with like 4 other people trying to like read these poems, and it kicked my butt. But it's hard, and it's hard because when all your life you've been taught to mush and gush over literature instead of critically think about it. And yeah, it's hard to find because there still isn't like a right answer, but it's just like a mystery solver. I can't even like describe it, but it makes you like open up your mind, and it's really important because really important things are hard to do. So
I agree with what Bella's saying. Like, me, for myself too, coming into Professor DeBarro's class, it was so different. It was so new. It was hard. I was looking at this, like Shakespeare. You grow up thinking Shakespeare is, and especially Romeo and Juliet, like that's the love story. That's that ultimate love story, the tragic ending, and it's so romantic. But you start to look into it, and you start to notice these other parts of it. You see the apothecary, you see the nurse, you see the social aspect, you see education being represented in there. You start to think, it starts to reflect on yourself even. You start to see I started to wonder, like, where would I fit into that story? Like, how would I be seeing these people, and how do I see these people? It kind of like when you really critically engage with like these texts, or at least in my case, I'm still trying to, but you start to see how it's evident in how you live, like even how you treat these texts and how you treat other people. Like when you start to critically treat these texts and you start to critically think of yourself, it changes your view of social constructs, of what you're taught to believe and how you're taught to live and what you're taught is right. And you start to wonder, which things have you just accepted? Which things have you just been like accepting as the romantic love story? And which things are like not really? Which things are you ignoring? Which things are getting pushed aside? Mm-hmm. And it's a little bit scary even, like to think about the things that you're ignoring or like you're romanticizing or making small of or making even a joke of or thinking of it as funny. But it's actually really serious issues that you need to critically engage with. Yeah, so I totally agree with what you're saying, but it is hard, but like it's also empowering in a sense. Mm-hmm. And I enjoy it. So yeah.
I was struck by something I think that Kayla and Leah brought up in terms of seeing and race, and you know, how they are constructed, are represented in ways that are completely inconsistent with the way they see themselves. And so, and of course, these are the kinds of issues that I've had to, in some ways, struggle with as a Black Shakespearean, right? What are the assumptions about what that means? What are the expectations for one to be Black in America, and then educated in Black in America, and then a Shakespearean scholar, a Black Shakespearean scholar in America? So, you know, I'm thinking in terms of our current political climate, and my, you know, somewhat my cynicism almost about where we are now with an all of a sudden consciousness of racial injustice. I'm incredibly suspicious of it. Like, so the question that I jotted down for today is, you know, that I'm therefore always suspicious when all of a sudden people notice something like Black suffering. Because, you know, I'm living this, I've lived this my entire life. And so I'm suspicious of it because of what we've identified in the power associated with seeing in Romeo and Juliet. Am I all of a sudden, or the suffering of Black people all of a sudden becoming visible for the interests of whatever the political media cultural establishment? Is it real? And everything, to me, everything suggests, in the way that we're discussing through Romeo and Juliet, everything suggests that it's not real. It's not genuine. And I don't, especially for the students, you know, I don't want you to be that jaded and pessimistic. But it's difficult for me not to be suspicious about, like, all of a sudden visibility of our particular oppressed group. So I don't know what we want to do with that, where we want to go with that, but I just felt that, especially in light of what Kayla and Leah introduced in terms of race and perception, thought it was important just to put that out there.
In a sense, it's also like perpetuating that sense of it being a spectacle.
Ah, right, right.
Like, it's still making a show out of it.
Yeah, and I was going to say that, Leah, actually, because if we think about it, we're in this new media age, this social media age, where even though this stuff was happening 20 some odd years ago plus, and we're just still going through it, now it's being displayed on a stage, on a spotlight for the whole world to see. And I think it was something Professor DeBarros was talking about, like, why is there all of a sudden this political objectification of the Black body? Like, why are we being glorified from these terrible incidences? Why are these people becoming famous after death? That's what's making the difference, I guess people want to call it, in this climate, but it's really not. It's not a difference. It's the same thing Tupac Shakur was talking about in his interviews years ago. But we're now being slammed with it in the face as we scroll down our feeds on a day-to-day basis, and especially young people attached to our phones. So how does now the recent development in technology tie into what Professor DeBarros was saying?
Great question. Right. How much of our seeing is channeled through social media? And how I feel as if I always have these matrix moments, and how real is that, right? Is that real? What is real? We have about, I guess, 8 minutes left, and I don't want to make anyone late for their next class or their next meeting. But this is, this interestingly, I think, sets us up for the next meeting. So October 15th, rape and the limits of language. So interestingly, we'll go from talking about sight or seeing and power to talking about, in some ways, voice, sound and power as it relates to rape represented in Titus Andronicus, and the ability or inability to give voice to that violation. So I didn't plan for us to go through the senses as they relate to power, but I think that'll be an interesting discussion as we prepare for it. So any other comments, reflections?
I just say thank you. Thank you to everybody. This is really wonderful, and I've enjoyed it and learned from it.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I really enjoyed it too.
Thank you.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I know Professor DeBarros had it in the syllabus as extra credit, and I decided to come, and I was just like, oh, it's just, Shakespeare. And I actually really enjoyed the conversations, and it was nice.
Great, thank you.
Wait, we get extra credit for this?
Yes, we do. You do, yes.
I had no idea.
Well, I also think it, I know we get extra credit for it, but it helped a lot, for like the next analysis that we have to write. It helps because this is like what we have to do in your class. And this is how we have to read when we read, this is what we have to think about. And I really encourage everyone in our class to go to these because it's not just for extra credit, like it genuinely is helpful. Because it's hard, like what we're doing is hard, but like I'm up for the challenge because I think I need it. Like I need it. Like I want it, like I want to think like this. Like I want to forever. That's
great.
Because it's important. Like I don't want to be, and I think it also has to do, this might sound really random, but I think voting right now has a lot to do with this. And people are going to vote on emotion, and people need to vote on, which is okay, but people need to vote on policy too. Don't just look at what you see on Instagram, like for the love of God, like go on a website, go look at what applies to you as a human and what your rights are and what you believe in, and see what person would bring those to light for you. Right. Like please vote. Please write it on your forehead so you see it in the morning. But what we're doing right now, go like when we hang up or like later tonight, like please go online and do your research, and everything that we talked about here, bring it to that. If you're still confused about this election, like please, like it is really important.
Of course, it is.
And I just really, for like all my young fellow students and for my older professors who are here, like I encourage everyone to do their research and to vote.
Will do.
We need to engage with it like we engage with the text. Like that's what we need to do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. So if there's nothing else, thank you all for joining us and for participating in a wonderful conversation. We'll try to continue this on a monthly basis. Okay. So take care. Have a good day.
Have a nice day.
All right.